So AEM Performance's colder intake is one of the more affordable and, in my humble opinion, one of the cooler looking open element intakes currently available for the 3.5 liter EcoBoost powered F150. I'm also happy to say that this intake does make pretty good horsepower and torque gains without even requiring a tune. If you're curious what kind of gains you should expect, go ahead and take a look at our dyno graphs. So we ran our truck on the dyno stock and it made 305 horsepower and 351 pound-feet of torque. We then installed the AEM intake and our truck ended up making 320 horsepower and 367 pound-feet of torque, which makes for pretty good peak gains. But what's nicer are the curve gains. We actually saw curve gains of up to 48 horsepower and 84 pound-feet of torque. Now besides those gains, there is a couple other things going for the AEM intake, and one of those things is how it's built. Below the $300 mark, this is still made out of aluminum tubes. It's got a really nice big badass filter on here with a metal heat shield, and everything's actually powder coated with a really cool gunmetal gray finish. Not many other intakes are featuring a gunmetal gray finish or a powder coat finish for that matter below the $300 mark. So again, if you're looking for a really cool looking intake that's made out of metal and not plastic for under $300, then the AEM intake should be at the top of your short list. The other thing that's nice about the AEM intake is it still retains part of the factory air box. It retains the bottom half as well as the factory inlet, which is nice because the EcoBoost inlet is actually pretty efficient at drawing in cold air. So with some of those other cheaper open element designs, you might lose a little bit of power comparatively speaking because they might not insulate the filter as well, thus you might not get as dense or cold air going to the motor as the AEM still provides. Other thing that's nice about the AEM intake is it installs very easily. There's simply a couple of rubber couplers and a little bit of clamp work that you got to do to tighten everything down and get it in place. You can definitely get this done with a couple of sockets and a hand ratchet, so for that reason I'm going to give the install a pretty simple 1 out of 3 wrenches on my patented difficulty meter. It shouldn't take you more than 30 minutes to an hour to get the AEM intake installed. To install your new intake, you will need a standard drive ratchet, a 7mm socket, an 8mm socket, and a 10mm socket. Optional tools include a long extension. Alright, so before we install our new intake, obviously we have to remove our factory air box, at least the top portion of it, and we also have to remove our factory intake tubes. Now the first thing you want to do is loosen the intake tubes themselves, and in order to do that you're going to need a 7mm socket. It's also helpful to have an extension because it is a bit of a squeeze in here. Once you've loosened those 2 clamps, go ahead and pop these little plastic retaining clips on the top of the air box. Go ahead and pop this wiring harness off the back of the air box as well, and you can remove the top of the air box and the tubes themselves as one piece. So that wiring harness that I was talking about is located right here, and this is for your intake temperature sensor. Again, you want to disconnect that because it's connected to the factory intake tubes. All you got to do is squeeze a little retaining clip on that and pop it loose. Alright, so we have our factory intake removed. You can see how much nicer the AEM looks next to this old and busted one, right? It's made out of plastic, it's kind of ugly. I really like the way AEM built this one. Again, you got this nice gray gunmetal finish on here, and you got the exposed element, which just looks good under the hood. But before we ditch this guy, we have to remove our intake temperature sensor. We have to swap it over to our new tubes here. You can see we got a little rubber grommet in place right here, so go ahead and pop him out, just twist him by hand, and transfer him over to the new intake tube. Alright, once you have your intake temperature sensor swapped over to your new intake tube, you can secure the intake tube to the heat shield. Now in order to do that, you're going to grab this little rubber mount here with 2 studs on either end. You're going to secure that into the little holes on the heat shield and the intake tube. They do provide flat washers and nuts for this. You're going to need a 10mm socket to tighten these down. Once you get this tightened down, you can go ahead and tighten down the clamps on the air filter. You're going to need an 8mm socket for those guys. All right, with your intake tubes assembled and the heat shield all set up and all that good stuff, you can throw the rubber couplers on to secure those to the turbo inlets inside the engine bay. Now this step-down coupler you're going to install on the truck side of the intake tube, but the straight one you're going to install on the intake side. It just makes it easier when you go to fit everything together. So go ahead and throw this guy on this top tube right here. Go ahead and tighten it down with one of the provided clamps. Again, you're going to need an 8mm socket. All right, once you got that step-down coupler in place on the truck side of that bottom intake tube, you can throw your new intake in place. Now you don't want to tighten down the heat shield just yet. You want to make sure you get both your new intake tubes lined up with both rubber couplers and then tighten those down again using your 8mm socket. Once you've done that, you can secure the heat shield to the airbox and you can also plug in your intake temperature sensor. All right, so once you got everything tightened down, go ahead and turn your truck over. Make sure you don't have any leaks through the tubes themselves, and that'll wrap up the install. That also wraps up my review of the AEM Performance Cold Air Intake fitting your 15 to 16 3.5L EcoBoost powered F150. I'm Travis, thanks for watching. For all things F150, keep it right here at AmericanTrucks.com.